Look at the US-Canada border right now. It doesn't feel like a simple partnership under stress. It feels like two deeply integrated economies testing how much pressure their relationship can actually withstand. For decades, Washington operated with the assumption that economic gravity alone would keep Ottawa aligned. The United States is Canada's largest trading partner, and the scale difference between the two economies has always given America confidence in negotiations. But economic interdependence cuts both ways, and that is the part often ignored in political messaging. When Donald Trump threatened sweeping tariffs, including talk of extreme across-the-board measures, the move fit his long-standing negotiating style. He escalates first. He creates maximum leverage through shock. He compresses the timeline. The expectation is that the other side, facing immediate disruption, comes to the table quickly and makes concessions. That strategy has worked in certain bilateral disputes, particularly where supply chains are less intertwined. But the U.S. and Canada are not distant trading partners. They are structurally fused economies. Under the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, supply chains were designed for efficiency, not resilience. In the auto sector, parts cross the border multiple times before a vehicle is complete. Assembly plants in Michigan depend on aluminum from Quebec and components from Ontario. Canadian factories rely on American engines and advanced electronics. A sudden 100% tariff, even as a threat, injects uncertainty into a system built on just-in-time delivery. Markets react not only to enacted policy, but to credible risk. When investors see the possibility of friction in a tightly synchronized manufacturing corridor, they price that risk immediately. Energy is even more complex. The United States produces significant oil, but many refineries, particularly in the Midwest, are configured to process heavier crude blends that come from Alberta. Replacing that input is not simple or immediate. Infrastructure, refinery design, and transportation networks lock in certain dependencies. If tariffs were applied to Canadian crude, the effect would likely be seen in regional fuel prices first. Even small disruptions in energy flows can ripple through transportation costs, agriculture, and consumer goods. Markets understand this chain reaction, which is why energy policy threats tend to amplify volatility. From Canada's perspective, diversification has been a strategic objective for years. Successive governments have sought broader trade access through agreements with the European Union and Indo-Pacific partners. A crisis accelerates existing plans. If Ottawa signals that it can redirect resources such as critical minerals, agricultural exports, or energy shipments toward Europe or Asia, that message is not only about economics. It is about reducing vulnerability. In global trade, optionality is power. The more alternatives a country has, the less leverage any single partner can exert. Rare earth minerals and battery inputs add another layer. Western economies are already attempting to reduce dependence on concentrated supply chains, particularly those dominated by China. Canada's reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and uranium make it strategically relevant. If Canadian policymakers frame new contracts with European or Asian buyers as long-term stability measures, that can reshape investment flows. Defense contractors and technology firms care deeply about supply predictability. Even the perception that access might narrow can shift sourcing strategies. The political dynamics inside the United States complicate the picture. Large corporations, particularly in automotive, retail, and agriculture, tend to push for stability. Their margins are sensitive to tariff shocks. Financial markets function as early warning systems, translating policy risk into capital flight or valuation drops. If business leaders conclude that tariff escalation threatens domestic employment or growth, pressure builds quickly behind the scenes. No administration is immune to that kind of internal lobbying. At the same time, domestic politics often reward visible toughness more than quiet compromise. Trump's political identity has long been tied to projecting strength in negotiations. Backing down after a dramatic threat can appear weak to supporters. Yet following through on aggressive tariffs risks measurable economic pain. That tension narrows the available space for maneuver. It becomes a calculation not only about trade balances, but about electoral timing, consumer sentiment, and market confidence. Mark Carney represents a different style. With a background in central banking and global finance, his approach emphasizes systemic stability and market credibility. Leaders with that profile tend to rely less on public confrontation and more on institutional coordination. Calling Brussels, Tokyo, or Seoul before engaging in a rhetorical exchange with Washington signals a shift from bilateral tension to multilateral positioning. It reframes the dispute as part of a broader conversation about reliability in global trade. The broader implication is not simply who wins a single standoff, it is whether trust erodes. International economic systems operate on expectations of continuity. When allies begin to question the predictability of U.S. trade policy, they hedge. Hedging does not always mean immediate rupture. It can mean incremental diversification, new procurement standards, or expanded regional agreements that gradually reduce reliance on the United States. Over time, those adjustments can become structural. For ordinary consumers, the impact would likely emerge through prices rather than headlines. Construction costs depend partly on Canadian lumber. Grocery bills reflect transportation and energy inputs. Vehicle prices incorporate cross-border manufacturing efficiencies. Even modest tariff-driven increases compound across supply chains. In an environment already sensitive to inflation, additional trade friction could amplify cost pressures. There are several plausible paths forward. One possibility is de-escalation after private negotiations, with both sides claiming victory while quietly preserving most trade flows. Another is partial implementation of targeted tariffs that signal resolve without collapsing the entire framework. The most disruptive scenario would be sustained, broad tariffs followed by retaliatory measures, pushing both economies into slower growth and reinforcing a longer-term strategic decoupling. What makes this moment significant is not only the immediate policy threat, but the strategic recalibration it encourages. Canada, long economically tethered to the United States, has incentives to build redundancy into its trade relationships. The United States, long confident in its central role, must weigh how aggressive tactics affect perceptions of stability. Economic alliances are durable when both sides see predictability as mutually beneficial. Whether this episode becomes a temporary shock or the beginning of a deeper realignment depends on choices made in the coming weeks. Markets will watch signals, not slogans. Businesses will watch implementation, not rhetoric. And voters will ultimately judge outcomes by tangible effects on jobs and prices. In highly integrated economies, leverage is rarely one-sided. The real question is not who can escalate faster, but who can manage interdependence more strategically without undermining their own foundations.